Today we're going to be talking about creating graphs and charts that meet WCAG 2.2 level AA accessibility requirements. My name is Rachel Reeves. I'll be doing today's presentation here in July of 2026. So if there's updates, of course, things could need to be adapted. So today we're going to talk about WCAG color contrast and non-text content requirements. We're going to talk about fixing some common graph and chart accessibility failures, talk about distinguishing the difference between decorative and informative data visualizations, and then a little bit about writing alternative text for our charts and graphs. If anyone is new here, just a little bit about Access Ingenuity. So Access Ingenuity has been working on digital accessibility since 2002. Our mission is to empower individuals with disabilities to live independently by providing access to digital content through assistive technology. We want to support organizations and making their digital materials, that's documents, websites, online learning, fully accessible to all. And we want to deliver solutions through assistive technology, hands-on training, accessibility testing, document and website remediation, and support and compliance monitoring. So we're really here for all steps of your accessibility process. So to start, we'll talk about designing our graphs and charts. And so when I'm talking about graphs and charts, examples of what I'm referring to are things like bar graphs, line graphs, pie charts, Venn diagrams, flow charts. You maybe have maps or sometimes heat maps. There's really a lot that falls into this category of different charts and graphs. And of course, everyone is also making their own types of graphs and charts too. So there's always unique things that come across my desk that I've never seen before. So when we're designing things, the best piece of advice is just simplicity. So making sure that our graphs and charts are pretty simple, that you're not making anything too complex. And if you do have something that's really complex, consider breaking up the complex data into multiple graphs or charts. Sometimes I've seen there's maybe a progression of charts where you have a map that shows the boundary of something, and then you have a second map that shows the boundary of a different item, and then the third map combines both boundaries to show where they overlap. So giving it in more bite-sized information before you combine complex charts, or same things if you're trying to compare multiple years and it's complex, or you're comparing a lot of categories over multiple years, sometimes breaking it into more bite-sized data is really helpful. And then I definitely would encourage you to consider making the information that's visually available also available in the text. So if you're showing a pie chart, making the data that's in that pie chart also available in the text in some way. This is really helpful for a lot of different reasons, but for users, sometimes a table is more helpful than a complex bar chart. So just giving multiple ways to view and interact with your information is just a user-friendly approach. And then we want to make sure we're always putting clear titles and labels for our graphs and charts. So making sure everything is labeled clearly, that it's all visible. I think we run into that a lot where if you're creating a bar chart inside of Office products, sometimes the whole label won't be there and it'll just end with ... which is not informative. So making sure we have clear titles and labels and they're entirely visible. And then I would definitely encourage including the exact data labels in your documents. This is just a user-friendly approach. And if you're making alternative text, it means that you don't have to do the guesswork of trying to figure out where's that line, what data point is that line on, or how tall is that bar for that bar chart. So having the exact data takes the guesswork out of it and make sure that everybody's getting consistent and completely accurate information. And then if we're creating legends for our charts, we want to make sure that our legends contain all the information that is in the graph or the map. It actually happens more often than I would expect, where there's 4 colors on the map, but the legend only has 3 patterns. So sometimes there's a mismatch in information in a legend versus what's on the actual graph. And so we want to make sure that that matches. And then one of the more common mistakes or things that we suggest fixing is if the legend doesn't match the order of like the placement. And I have an example of that coming up as well so that you can see what I mean by placing the legend. And then we want to make sure that our content is placed in a user-friendly way. So making sure that when we add those titles to diagrams, graphs, and charts for the added understanding that those titles are actually typed. So it's like real text. The more it's real text and can be tagged as a heading or tagged as a P tag, that's going to make it more user-friendly. So a lot of times those headings are inside of the images, and we would encourage you to put them outside. Not a hard rule, but something to consider. And then we would also consider linking or referencing to other information. So if you have information in the image and then that information is included in another format in your document, we would definitely encourage you to link or reference that. So a lot of times that looks like saying, see table 1 or reference appendix A for more information. And so making it very clear that this graph or bar chart that has 200 data points that you can't include the exact data for, if they go to appendix A, they'll be able to find that exact data. So it's really helpful to just make it very clear that the information exists somewhere else in the document. And then if you are doing infographics or some sort of diagrams, it's important to try and put your content top to bottom, left to right whenever possible, and avoid jumping around the page. Just make sure it's a very logical flow that most people would be able to catch on to. And then if you are including text around your graphs, I would encourage you to avoid statements that say something like the graph to the right or the image included on the next page, since not everyone is going to see that placement in the same way. And so saying something like reference graph number 2 or figure 3 gives a detailed map of this. So using actual labels and titles to reference makes it more user-friendly for all users. And again, bonus points if you are able to link that to each other if they're not right next to each other. So here's the example of designing with poor legend placement. I completely made up bar chart. It's just called chart title, and there's just axis title and category 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so in each of these 4 categories, there's 3 bars for apples, oranges, and bananas. And so the bars go left to right, but the legend actually has multiple columns. And for my example, all of the bars are just white. So all of them are the same color. And so it could be very easy for someone to assume that the bar on the left is apples and the middle bar is bananas and the right bar is oranges based on the columns in the legend. Or someone could also interpret this as the left is apples, the middle is oranges, and the right is bananas. So because the legend doesn't correlate perfectly to the bar chart, there is a chance that people are going to just get wrong information because the order could go multiple ways. It's not clear which bar corresponds to which legend item. And so one way to fix this, so I have another example, same thing, but I've changed the legend and I've put it actually at the top now, right under the chart title, and it's going left to right. So now there's no columns. All 3 categories, apples, oranges, and bananas, are reading left to right, and they visually match perfectly to the left to right that's in the bars in the chart below. So this is a great way to make sure that there's no guesswork of which data points belong to which item. So this is how you would design it. And then in my example, I also put a call out for watching for lines cutting off data tables. So I made this chart inside of PowerPoint, and it often defaults to having the value lines in the background, and it actually is covering up one of the data points of 2.8. So it's hard to read the 2.8. And so you would want to make sure that you're either getting rid of those lines or putting a background on these text boxes for the data points so that everyone can see them and they are not cut off. So we're going to dive into color contrast requirements and how they relate to our graphs and charts. There's more to color contrast, but today I'm going to focus just on how it relates specifically to graphs and charts, but these apply in even more circumstances. So if you are new to WCAG, that stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so WCAG is the standards that we're using, the industry standards, and there's different levels. And so today we're talking about the level AA requirements for colors. And there's 3 main ideas that we have to watch out for. So we want to make sure we're checking for use of color alone. So that's WCAG 1.4.1. We want to check for color contrast for non-text elements. That's WCAG 1.4.11. And then the last one is color contrast for text, which is WCAG 1.4.3. So we'll go through some examples of how this applies to different situations. So the first one, which is color alone. So the WCAG requirement is that we want to make sure color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. So color cannot be the only way that something is communicated. For most charts, looking at the legend is the first step. And if the color is the only difference between the categories that you're using, it is using color. And then you have to figure out if it is only using color. So the legend is the first place that I would suggest looking. And then just a reminder that this color alone, it does apply not just to images, but could be something in your text as well. So if in your text you have an example statement would be updates are highlighted. So then you're relying on whatever highlight color you're using. And so that would fail for this requirement. Or if your document has a statement that's something like numbers in red are negative, then again, it's using color to convey meaning. The only way you would know it's negative is if you can see the color red. And then another example is with hyperlinks. So we do see where hyperlinks are using color alone, which is why usually you have an underline with hyperlinks. It's kind of the standard format because adding an underline or bold formatting in addition to the color is how you make the hyperlinks accessible. The hyperlinks is a great example of the difference between color and color alone. So you can't just have a blue hyperlink, but you could have a blue and underline hyperlink. So making sure there's another formatting, or inside of our charts, we got to make sure that there's another way to identify the information, that it can be color and, but it can't be color alone. So I have a couple pie charts on screen that show examples of color alone with fake information with 4 quarters. And so in my first pie chart, each of the quarters are a solid color. So we have a solid green, a solid blue, a solid yellow, and then a solid red. And so it's helpful to think to yourself, if all of the colors were the same, would you still be able to understand the data? So then I copy pasted this pie chart and made all of the sections black. And so if you look at the pie chart, they're all black. There's one slice of the pie chart over 50%. And if you take away the color, there's no way for you to know which quarter that was. And so this is relying on color alone to communicate the information. So this would be a failure that would for sure need to be fixed. And there's a couple different ways to fix it. So the first one we'll talk about is adding shading and patterns. Obviously, this can't apply to all images, but it does for the most common ones. So pie charts, bar graphs, line graph, adding different patterns to that. So shading and patterns is a great option. The solution is you just add patterns to the categories. You could still have one solid color. So I've pasted the same pie chart, and this time the first quarter is a solid green. The second quarter is blue with white polka dots. The third quarter is a yellow with black stripes. And then the fourth quarter is pink with a darker pink checkered. And so we have 3 patterns and 1 solid color. But it's also important to know that your patterns have to pass color contrast. So adding patterns is how we're not using color alone, because now users can look for a solid, polka dots, stripes, and checkered. But if they can't see the checkered and stripes and polka dots, it's not actually helpful. So all of our patterns have to have a 3-to-1 color contrast ratio. And so that's needed between your foreground and background. So the white dots on the blue background must have a 3-to-1 ratio. And we will post in chat a handout, which has links to a few different places where you can learn how to test this ratio. So there's definitely things you can download to your computer, which you'll see some screenshots of the color contrast analyzer in some future slides here. And so that's what I enjoy using to check color contrast, but there's also several websites that help you check color contrast and let you know what the ratio is. And they'll also give you a green check mark if the ratio is passing, or a red X if it's failing. So it's easy to figure out and compare those 2 colors. So that'll be in a handout as well, so you can reference. If you are working in Microsoft Office, there's lots of options to add pattern lines for line graphs and then formatting bars and shapes with patterns as well. So I have a screenshot of what those two look like inside of Office. So whether you're making them in Excel or MS Word or PowerPoint, all of these options exist to add multiple patterns or different line shapes. So there's endless combinations you could add. And so I touched on this that your patterns have to pass that 3-to-1 contrast. And so that's that second WCAG requirement of non-text contrast. The ratio of adjacent colors has to be 3-to-1. And so this is for things that are essential for understanding, but they're not text. So they're not letters and numbers. And so the example we just showed is the pieces of the pie chart. So if you're using patterns to show the pieces, then the patterns have to pass 3-to-1. But also, if your pie chart, the slices are touching each other, then the colors of where the pie chart slices touch would have to pass 3-to-1. If you have a bar chart, all of your patterns have to pass 3-to-1, but also your bar chart to the background has to pass 3-to-1. So the only way you can see where a bar ends is if you can make out the border compared to the background. If you have a line chart, all of your lines are essential information. And so those are going to have to pass 3-to-1 in the background. If you have lines that are overlapping consistently, it's important to make sure that you can see the difference between the lines themselves. If you have stacked bar charts where the different colors or different patterns touch, it's important that the boundaries of those bars are 3-to-1. If you have a map, so if you're showing California and all of the counties of California, those borders for the counties have to pass with the background color. And any symbols or icons. So thinking about if you have arrows pointing somewhere, or if you have a star on a slice of the pie chart because the star indicates a change from last year, then that star has to have a 3-to-1 ratio. So it's important that pretty much anything that is in your images that someone has to be able to understand or get information from, we have to make sure that they can see it. So you have to have a 3-to-1 contrast. So a little bit more on the patterns and the legends. So I have the example of a pie chart that has 3 patterns and that one solid, but making sure that your legend icons are big enough that you can make out the pattern. So sometimes, especially with Office, the legend little icons that show what the pattern is, sometimes those are so small that you can't actually make out the pattern that it correlates to. So making sure that your legend is also very clear so you can make out the patterns that match. And on my screen, I have screenshots of that color contrast analyzer I was talking about. And so I've done 2 examples of the red with the white, which the 4th quarter is red with white polka dots. And so you can tell in my screenshot, the color contrast analyzer says lots of green check boxes. So it says it has a high contrast. Everybody can see those polka dots. We're good to go. And then just for reference, I did the red with black. So if I was to choose black polka dots, you can see that it's a bunch of red X's. So it does not have good color contrast ratio. It is not passing. So that is why I chose the white polka dots over the black. So just putting those screenshots up there so you can see how sometimes it's very clear if you're picking white versus black for your pattern, which one's a better option. So we talked about patterns as a solution for color alone, but another solution is making the graph or the chart supplemental. So I have an example of the same pie chart up with the 4 quarters, but in this example, the 4 quarters, so they're still all solid colors, so there's no patterns anymore, but I've added labels next to the slices. So I still have my legend there, which arguably you wouldn't need, but right next to each of the slices of the pie chart, I also have which quarter it belongs to. And so this way, it's not relying on color alone because you can just visually see, okay, this slice of the pie that's more than 50% is clearly 1st quarter because 1st quarter is right next to it. So we've labeled. So if we're adding the labels, that means that the color is not the only way. So remember, we talked about with hyperlinks, you can have blue and underline. And so this is having solid color and labels. And so because we have it in another format with labels, we can consider the color alone to be supplemental. So you aren't required to fix it, which is great because sometimes you run out of patterns, or sometimes those patterns can be very dizzying, or there's just too much information. So visually, it's not always helpful to have lots and lots of patterns, or you may just have too much information. So adding labels is a great workaround. And then solution two that I have on screen is including the information as text in the document. So you can leave the chart as is. You don't have to add labels. You could leave it all solid and have no pattern. So again, the chart could have a color alone failure, but if you are including the information as text, then it's going to be a supplemental. So we have the visual option and we have text. And so it's not color alone because someone could read the text. And so I have two examples of what this text could look like. One common example, and the one I would recommend most often, is putting it into a table format. So presenting the data in a table format. And so I have a table with two columns. And so column one is the quarter and column two is the sales. And so I've just listed out first, second, third, fourth quarter and put the data for the sales in it. Again, completely made up data. The other way you could present it is you could present it in a narrative. So underneath this, I also have a sentence that says the sales for the first quarter was 8.2, second quarter 3.2, third quarter 1.4, and fourth quarter 1.2. First quarter had increased sales because of a new year promotion for new members. A lot of times, if you're including charts and graphs, there's probably a conclusion that you're looking for people to draw, or maybe there's a reason why in my example, I said first quarter was significantly more because there was a promotion going on. So maybe that's important information for your users to know. So sometimes that narrative is just really beneficial and makes it so that you don't have to fix color alone. So again, presenting all of the information that's in the image in text, we're making the image supplemental. And so if we have a supplemental image, then we can make exceptions for color failures, specifically color alone in this situation. So then labels, just a little bit more about them. So I have the same pie chart with the labels, and then I've taken it and I've removed the color so that it's easy to tell that even if the color is gone, so all of the pieces of the pie are white, that it is still easy to see which piece of the pie belongs to which quarter because that label is right outside of that pie. And then I've also added the data points to my example, which is really helpful as well, so that no one's guessing what percentage, which arguably I probably should have put the percentages in this pie chart instead of the data points. So first quarter is 8.2, which I should have percentage would probably be more informative in this situation, which inside of Office, you have lots of options to add these data points, which I'll show you where that is as well. So you can add the data points. It's in the same area where you can add patterns and stuff like that. And then the last color contrast item is color contrast for text. And so this is the WCAG 1.4.3 contrast, and that's a AA requirement. And so this splits the color contrast based on the size of the text. And so if it's regular text, that's going to be less than 14 point bold or 18 point regular, or if it's large text, then it's greater than 14 point bold or 18 point regular. So you first have to figure out what size of text is it, and then from there you're going to go and figure out which contrast ratio it has to have. So it either is going to have a 3:1 or a 4.5:1. And so the examples of text in your charts and graphs is going to be all of your titles. So your chart titles, your legend titles, any text that's in your legend. If you've added data labels, all of your data labels have to have this contrast, any access labels, any text that exists, any numbers or characters that exist within your chart has to have this kind of contrast so that users can read it. Again, with the only exception being if it's supplemental, but even if it's supplemental, you should always make sure your text passes color contrast. So I have an example of a failure up on screen. So again, my 4-quarter pie chart, but this time I have put the labels inside of the slices of the pie. So my green background for first quarter has first quarter in black text on top of the green, And my second quarter has black text on top of the blue labeled inside of that slice. And then I have screenshots of the color contrast analyzer that compares the text. And so it's comparing that black text to the blue of the second quarter. And so this has a 2.3 to 1 ratio, which is failing at all font sizes. So it doesn't matter how big the black text is on this blue color I have, it's never going to pass color requirements. And then I also put an example of the black text on the green. And so this has a 4.1 to 1 ratio. And so this is failing for only regular font sizes. And so you'll see there's inside of Color Contrast Analyzer, there's a section that gives you a breakdown for the AA 1.4.3 contrast requirement. And so you can see that there's a red X that says it's failing for regular text, but it's passing for large text. And so this would mean I would have to go into my document and see what size the font is for first quarter. And if it's 14 point bold and bigger, then it's passing. Or if it's 18 point not bold, just regular, then it's passing. But if it's less than that, it's going to be failing. And I have to choose a different color, put it somewhere else. I have to fix it. It depends on the size of the text, ultimately, what ratio you have to have. And so here is an example of how you could fix these. And this is probably one of the more common errors we see. So you could obviously change the colors. So I have the failing pie chart on screen, and the next pie chart, I've changed it to white text on the green and white text on the blue. And so now it's passing. It's clearly easier to see. Or the tried and true method is just move it outside of the color. So the third example, I've just taken and made all of the text, black text on the white background outside of the pie chart. I mean, there are little lines pointing to the different sections of the pie chart, which you can add for added value, or depending upon how many slices you have, you maybe have to use the lines in order to fit all the text around it. So that's the solution to make sure that our text is passing color contrast. I wanted to show another non-text failure. So this is the same pie chart, but I've used a new color palette, which, if my memory serves me right, I think that this was a color palette that I was prompted by Office to use. So if you're here for my other webinars on MS Word, there is terrible templates out there. So do not always take what is offered to you by Office with a grain of salt when it comes to color. So there's a light beige, a medium beige, a gray, and this light pink color. And so they're all very much calming colors, but none of them have good contrast against each other. And so all of these touching colors have to have the 3:1 ratio. And so this ratio is so that you can see the size of the slices. So there are users who wouldn't be able to see when first quarter meets that second quarter. And so you wouldn't know where that line is. And I've included the color contrast analyzer screenshots of comparing all of these colors. And it's a bunch of red X's because it fails for all of them. Most of these color checkers, you're going to have different sections where it's checking the different types of contrast. So that first section is the color contrast of text. The second section is color contrast of text, but if you're meeting AAA requirements, and that bottom one is the non-text contrast. And so that's what is applying to this situation because we're comparing the colors, which is not text. And so these colors have to have that 3:1 ratio. And so here is a solution for that pie chart. So you could change the colors, but it would be very difficult to find a color scheme that all of the colors are 3:1 to each other. So it's very difficult, especially if you have several more slices of your pie chart or more bars to your bar chart. So one of the easiest solution is to add a border. And so that's what I've done in my second image. And so I've just put a black border around all four of these colors. I've left the colors the same, but now you don't need to know the colors in order to identify which quarter it belongs to. And you can now definitely see the borders of all of these slices. And so that is a solution. So it was failing, but now I've created a workaround so that you don't need the colors. All of the colors could be white and it would be fine. So now color is supplemental. It's not failing for color alone. And another option we've talked about is adding that data table or the narrative or putting labels directly on it, just so that the image itself is supplemental. So it's always a good backup. The more text you add, the less likely it is going to be a failure for color because it's not using just the image to convey information. And so here's an example of adding that data table. So I have the same image, which I did include the borders and I did include the percentages in the label, but I also included the data table. And so adding the data is just a great usability for everyone so that no one's guessing first quarter is 58%, but visually I could have easily thought it was 55% because it's hard to tell exact percentages or exact values. And then the table I would encourage using because it does reduce your alternative text. So if your image is supplemental, meaning that it's not relying on the image alone, but it's somewhere else in the text, then our alt text can be short and reference the place it's found. So for example, this pie chart could have alt text that just says pie chart of 2024 sales, exact data is included in table 1. And so then you don't have to list out all of the different information. My example is pretty, there's only 4 values, so it's not a lot of alt text to list out. But if you're talking about 5 categories over 10 years, that's a lot of information for someone to have to wade through in alt text. And some of the information may not be relevant to them, which I have seen lots of reports where it's comparing counties or comparing zip codes. And I would imagine most users only care about what's relevant to their county or their zip code is the main idea that they're looking for. And so to have to wade through a lot of information is not helpful. So having a table makes it so someone could easily jump to the column that's the place that they're looking for or the data that they're searching for. And so these data tables are definitely a user-friendly experience. So I mentioned Office, and so if you are using Office to create these graphs and charts, Office does have this option where you can add a data table. So if you go to Chart Elements, there's a checkbox to add the data table, and it just automatically puts it at the bottom. So I have a screenshot of that, and then you can see it just auto-populates it there. So if you're looking for a really quick, easy fix, or you're dealing with something that someone already made, and you just need to add the data real quick, that is an option. But it's not going to be available for all. Sometimes the more information that's in a chart, the harder it is for this data table to populate where it shows all of the information and shows all the categories. So there may be times where you do have to create that table outside of the image. It also is technically a little bit faster for tagging if you have a table that's separate from the actual graphic. So if you are starting from scratch, I would encourage you to just paste that table in addition to the image and not use this data table. But again, if you're in a pinch or working with something that already exists, this data table option is great. And then again, my example has some awful colors, and this is an Office template. So make sure that if you're using bar graphs and pie charts, we're looking out for accessible colors. I want to note a few color exceptions. So if something is supplemental, which we've talked about, so images that are not essential for understanding or they're explained in the text, those are going to be supplemental images, so you can make some color exceptions for them. Or if your document or the graph is labeled in a way that makes the colors supplemental, then we can say the colors are supplemental, so they're not required to be fixed. And then there is a note that some complex images have an exception. So something like a heat map, you may have no other option but to use it as a color. So when the colors for a heat map, usually there's no borders and the colors fade into each other to show the temperature if it's a heat map about temperature. But of course, there's heat maps that have nothing to do with temperature. And so there's no other way. And so there's this WCAG exception that's for graphical objects. And it says that if parts of graphics are required to understand the content, except when a particular presentation of graphics is essential to the information being conveyed. So if the only way is through this heat map or something that's using color, it can be considered essential. And the definition of essential is if it's removed, it would fundamentally change the information or functionality of the content, and the information and functionality cannot be achieved in another way that would conform. So if there's just no other way to show it, there is a little bit of a WCAG exception there. I would still strongly recommend that you include a narrative that goes along with your heat map so that users who aren't able to interpret interpret the heat map, get the big idea or the main concepts that you're looking for, or if there's a specific data point that the heat map is for, including that in the narrative is really helpful so that everyone's on the same page of what are you supposed to get from this, and everybody's getting the same information, whether you can understand and see the heat map or not. I wanted to show a couple more examples here. So I have a fake data table for 12 months of sales over 3 years. And so on this next slide, I've converted this data into a stacked bar chart. So this is failing. So there's a red, a pink, and a green, and they're stacked on top of each other. And so this is failing because those colors, not everyone can tell where the red stops and the pink starts. And so you would have to add, on this next slide, I've added patterns as a solution. It's not the prettiest. It's a little busy, so I would strongly recommend that table being right under this or referenced so that it's a little bit more clean and easy to see, but patterns could be used, as well as you can see that I put a border around that pink because the pink on the white background was going to fail. And so in order for the pink not to fail, I had to put a black border around it. So sometimes borders and patterns are needed. I have another example where I've put this data into a line graph. And so this line graph is failing because there's this light beigey gray line that's failing against the white background. And all three with lines, there's no easy way to know which line goes to which category or which year in this case, because it's not a bar chart where it's left to right because these lines are going all over the place. And so in this next example, I've added patterns to each of the lines. So there's a circle dot pattern, and then there's another dotted line that's more of a longer dash. And then there's the beige color, but I've darkened it. So it does pass. Another option is sometimes you can add symbols to the data points. So you could say that each of the places where the exact data is, maybe for 2022 in this example, it's a square. And then for 2023, there's a little triangle at the data point. And then 2024, there's a circle. And so you could also use symbols or icons at the points so that users can see which point belongs to which year. And then again, just emphasizing, I have the figure here. So I've taken a smaller image of the line graph and called it figure 1, sales 2022 to 2024. And then underneath this figure, I've written the appendix table A. And so you could even hyperlink table A to an appendix. And then I have an example of that table A where I've labeled it table A sales 2022 to 2024. And then I've even included data for figure 1. And then you could even hyperlink that back to figure 1. So it would be a really user-friendly approach for everyone. So they could easily jump to the table if they wanted exact data or need to look at it closer, and then jump back to the image if it's earlier in your document. I have a couple examples here of maps that I just wanted to throw out for anyone who is doing maps. And specifically, this example I'm showing is a map on an actual image. So if you're working with Google Earth or something like that, you obviously can't control the color of the earth or the color of the trees or the color of the ocean, whatever that figure is. And so one great way to do that is to do a border that is actually dashed and rotating colors. So in this example, it's going between black and white. So depending upon what the background is, at some point, you're going to be able to see the general border. You may not be able to see it 100% of the time, but it's pretty close. So you're going to be able to make it out. And another example, sometimes for maps, we see in this case where you have Google Earth in the background or a photograph, is if you add text, make sure that you have a solid background on that text box so that you can always see it. Okay, I'm going to touch a little bit about adding alternative text or alt text to your graphs. So images fall into 3 categories, and we do webinars just on writing alternative text alone. So for sure, tune back because I'm breezing over some things and only talking about what's important to graphs and charts. But there's 3 buckets of images. So we have decorative images, supplemental images, and informational images. So our decorative images are going to be images that don't add any value or information for the user. If you're here for PDF stuff, we talk about this as being marked as artifact, or in the web world, it's called null. And so basically it's an image that's not important, it's not essential. Sometimes you're going to see icons that aren't necessary for understanding or images that are repetitive. On my screen, an example is I have this lighter rectangle that's off to the right, and it's completely design. It's not important. No one would need to know it's there. And so that is an image. Technically, it's a box, so it would come across as an image in some situations, but we're going to call it decorative. And then same thing with maybe if I had a logo on every page, I would mark it as decorative after the first time, or if it's not significant anymore. So these are decorative. So most of your graphs and charts are not decorative. If you're including a graph or a chart, usually it's because it's important to include. I don't think I've ever seen a pie chart that I would consider completely decorative unless it's, yeah, I actually can't think of an example. There probably is an example out there, but for 99% of your graphs and charts, you're including them because they're important, and so they would not be decorative. The next category is the supplemental images, which we've touched on a little bit. And so that's going to be the images that convey supplemental information. So that means it exists or it's available in another format within the document, whether that's in the text or the tables or an appendix. And so the image itself is not the only place to find that information. We do want to put alt text on supplemental images, but the description can be brief. So it's required, but it can be brief. So we talked about this as a great option for complex images or those really complicated bar charts, making sure that we include the data somewhere else, and then we can make our alt text nice and short. So I have an example of this. I have a screenshot of an example page where I have figure 1 favorite fruits, where I've put a pie chart with all of the favorite fruits of participants. And then right underneath that, I have table 1 favorite fruits of participants with 2 columns where I list out that same information. So the image is a pie chart, but the data has that same information. So on this page, I could make the alt text for that pie chart be pie chart of favorite fruits of participant. Data is available in table 1. And so I don't have to list out every single one of those data points. I can just reference the exact table that it's located in. So it really saves time on the alt text, or if you're doing monthly reporting, and so maybe these numbers are changing as well, it's really helpful because you don't have to go update the alt text because the numbers change, the graph changes, but the alt text is the same because you're still referencing the same table. And then the third bucket of images is the informational images. So these are going to be most of your graphs and charts. They are critical for understanding if the image was missing. So if you deleted it, then there would be missing information for the user. And so we need to make sure that these have alt text. So they must have alt text, and our alt text should be informative and succinct. So this is not only graphs and charts, but also logos. If you have photographs that are essential, equations, symbols or icons that show meaning, obviously the charts and graphs, the diagrams that we've talked about, Venn diagrams, flow charts, all of the pie charts and graphs, maps, and then sometimes illustrations too. So it's maybe not a photograph, but like a diagram or a drawing or illustration. Those are all essential information. And then I've included another figure, which is the same pie chart of the favorite fruits of participants. But in this example, there is no table. And so I would have to actually write out all of the alt text. The alt text for the pie chart would be pie chart of favorite fruits of participants. Data includes apple 50%, banana 10%, watermelon 10%, strawberry 5%, pineapple 5%, grapes 10%, cherries 8%, and orange 2%. And so you have to include all of the data because it's visually all there. So even if your narrative was saying the most important part is that the apple was 50%, you can't just have alt text that says pie chart with apple 50%. You need to include all of the information that's visually available so that everyone is getting the same content. So you can see how if your pie chart has even more information, that's some really long alt text. So the table is super helpful. That's a wrap for what I have to tell you. Again, there's much more that we could dive into for both color and how it applies to other situations. And obviously there's more images than pie charts. So stay tuned for more webinars where we dive into that in detail. If you want to contact our team with any questions or ideas for future presentations, feel free to email our general inbox at documents@accessingenuity.com. I will also post some of this into chat. Chat will also have the Access Ingenuity feedback form. So if you have any feedback for me today or ideas on future presentations, things that would be helpful, feel free to fill out that form and we'll get back to you or take your advice. We have more webinars coming up. So July 15th, we'll be doing JAWS, which is the screen reader program, and we'll be talking about how JAWS works with Excel. And then July 22nd, I'll be back about making accessible Excel spreadsheets. So what you can and cannot do inside of Excel, how to make it accessible. And then July 29th, we'll do the Topaz desktop magnifiers. That's a device that we sell and train on here at Access Ingenuity. Okay. Thank you for everyone who joined today, and hopefully we'll have you back for future webinars. Have a good rest of your day.